Okay, we are going to explore two things today. We're going to explore some of the biblical personalities, in particular, of course, Esau and Yaakov and their relationship, and also experience some of the techniques and literary beauty used to convey something about these personalities. And just one word of introduction, one of the beautiful things about Tanakh is that there are really no black and white personalities. Obviously, there are better people and worse people, but even the better people tend to have flaws, and even the lesser people tend to have their good points. For example, we could list the mistakes that Moshe Rabbeinu makes, that Miriam Hanaviyah makes, right? It's clear that even those that were meant to have reverence for occasionally mess up. Conversely, it's not an accident that Chazal attributed Kibbud Av to Esau, that he was excellent at honoring his parent, perhaps his father more than his mother, but nonetheless, and I think we'll see that today. So the first thing to be aware of is that when we're looking at these characters, there's going to be some gray, there's going to be some positive and negative mixed together. Okay, with that, let us start our story. And I hope we have time to get to it all because there's really a tremendous amount here. Okay, so of course, Rivka feels funny during her pregnancy, and she goes to get a prophecy about it. And one of the things the prophecy says, if anyone wants to look it up, it is in Breshit Chaf Hey. Okay, and we're now in Pasuk. We are in Breshit Chaf Hey. Okay, let me just let somebody else into the room here. Okay, here we go. We are in Breshit Chaf Hey, Pasuk Chaf Gimel. And one of the things the prophecy says is Rav Yavod Tzair, which I think most of us would think means, okay, the elder will serve the younger, that Esau will ultimately somehow be subject to Yaakov. But maybe it's a bit more complex than that. I just want to ask, is it better if I share screen or everyone could just find the sources on their own? Should I share screen?
The sources have been shared.
Okay, so I'm write in the chat if I should do this, but I'm not sharing screen at this point. Okay, I'm just, I'm going to look at the sources myself, but I am not sharing screen. So if those who have the sources, you could go to the Radak. I see I didn't number it. I don't know why. It's between 4 and 5, the famous unnumbered Radak. Now, the Radak does a big favor to me for the following reason. When I give shir in Hebrew, one of my classic mistakes is that I forget the word et. Because if you think about it, the word et is not really natural for an English speaker, right? If I want to say he closed the door, so I might think hu sagar hadelet. I'm not going to think hu sagar et hadelet. So for a long time, the word et was a bane for me. I would forget the word et. So I was always looking for some meaning, and I always wondered, like, what does the word even help? Who needs this word et? All it does is make me make Hebrew mistakes. However, we're going to see a very interesting Radak now where the word et is crucial, or perhaps the absence of the word et is crucial. Let's go back to that Radak. What does it mean, V'rav Yavod Tzair? Says Radak, Lo Zachar Imahem Milat Et. The word et is not mentioned. Shimora al HaPa'ul. The word et would clarify what's happening here. Vine Hadavar Misupak. But now we are in a state of safek. We're in a state of doubt. V'lo bi'er mi yavod et chavero. It is not clear who's going to serve who. Harav et hatzair or hatzir et harav. Let me explain why he thinks the pasuk could go both ways. Okay, because maybe some of you are not thinking that. Says the Radak, wait, what do we have here? We have, right, a pasuk that can be read, V'rav Yavod Tzair, the elder will serve the younger, or V'rav, the elder, pause, Yavod Tzair, the younger will serve him. So you could read it as V'rav Yavod Tzair, the elder will serve the younger, or V'rav Yavod Tzair. Indeed, the younger will end up serving the elder. And the Radak says this is not an accident. It is purposely ambiguous. It can be read two ways, which is fascinating if Tanakh would do this. Why it can be read two ways? Says Radak, because Jewish history will play out in both directions based on our actions. Sometimes we'll have the upper hand, and sometimes we will not. And that is all dependent on how we behave and historical forces. So the pasuk is meant to go both ways. Now, why is the absence of the word et crucial? Well, those who know a little Hebrew grammar, you know what? Even if you don't, I think you'll appreciate this. If the pasuk had said v'rav yavod et hatzair, what would happen? Et would clarify what the object of the sentence is. It would not be ambiguous. Rav yavod et hatzair would mean the elder will serve the younger. So here I was excited. Maybe it's not the presence of the word et, but the absence of the word et creates meaning. Because it doesn't have et, the pasuk could go both ways. What's Rav Yavod Seir? That depends. Now, let's say someone in this wonderful greeting room here says to me, Tanakh would not do that. It would never have purposeful ambiguity, or a pasuk that is purposeful could be read two ways. So I have a really good example that I hope will convince you that that's not true. Okay, I imagine there's some people listening who really like Sefer Yonah. Yonah is a pretty fascinating Sefer. We'll read it on Yom Kippur pretty soon. What is the content of Yonah's prophecy? Well, Yonah says, Od arba'im yom, in another 40 days, v'ninveh nehapachet, Nineveh will be overturned. Now, we all know that 40 days later, Nineveh is not overturned. So does that mean that Yonah is a false prophet? So there are different ways to explain it. But one way, a very powerful way, is in the Abarbanel. The Abarbanel says the word nehapachet could have two meanings in Tanakh. Nehapachet could be overturned in a destroyed kind of way. But of course, what else could nehapachet be? They overturned their society, their value system, right? Oh, very good. Rafi Levy is our star student here today. Okay, that they did tshuva, right? They changed who they were. But maybe Yonah's prophecy intentionally could go both ways. It's almost like Yonah saying, in another 40 days, Nineveh will have some kind of nehapachet. What kind? That's up to the people of Nineveh. They could remain corrupt and cruel, and it will be destroyed. They could change things, change the nature of their society, and it will be overturned in a moral kind of way. Nineveh nehapachet. So I think that's a pretty convincing example. So already, guys, we're going to see a couple of techniques. We already have one technique that shows that Torah is very subtle in its writing. You could have purposeful ambiguity. Nineveh nehapachet, Rav Yavod Seir. Okay, let's move on to number two. Great. And now, I said before that there aren't really black and white characters. And I think that when Chazal attribute kibbud av v'aim to Esau, they're not doing drash, they're doing pshat. Okay, it's in the psukim. For example, we know that Esau used to bring food to his father, Yitzchak. So clearly he takes care of his father. Later in the story, I don't know if we'll get there, but he tries to take a marriage choice that will please his father. So clearly Esau cares about Yitzchak. So he indeed is good at keeping it. So let's not make him black and white. But maybe now we'll also see perhaps some character flaws of Esau. Again, he might not be all black, but he has some darker parts. So I'm in the Psukim again. The Psukim is not on your source sheet. Just bear with me. What do we hear about Esau? So a couple of things. First of all, we hear about his physical characteristics. Now, I know a lot of you who are reading literature might say, okay, that's classic. We hear about the physical characteristics of its characters. But let's think for a second, right? Really, there's a biblical style. If we all thought about it, does the biblical style tend to emphasize the characteristics of its protagonists? I think the answer is obviously no. If I asked you, let's say we have an artist in the room. They want to draw a biblical portrait of Avram Avinu. Okay, how much biblical evidence would they have to go on? I'm going to answer 0. We do not know if Avram was tall or short. Was he chubby or skinny? Was he blonde-haired or brown-haired? We have no idea, right? There is nothing to go on in the physical portrait of Avram. And maybe that's part of the biblical style. We don't need to know what they look like. Somehow Tanakh does not tend to think that's so significant. But of course, what does that mean? So I think it's one of the beauties of biblical writing. If you normally don't do something, so then when you do it, will you not all agree that takes on significance? So I think that's also a good point. Every time Tanakh tells me someone's physical traits, I should ask why. So we're told a lot about Esau. We're told that Esau is very hairy, and we're told that he's admoni. Now, admoni comes from the word for red, okay? And at that point, okay, I see that the questions are at the end. Okay, so Dvir, should I stop with like 5 minutes to go, 10 minutes to go? You'll let me know. Okay, so so let's think about, okay, great. Let's think about Esau. Again, Admoni, he's either a redhead or perhaps he has a red complexion, a ruddy complexion. So I'm going to ask a question you could answer in the chat, and I'm going to give you a little time. I'll say something else meanwhile. What would be the categories when Tanakh would give physical characteristics? If we're not interested in Avram, what Avram looked like. By the way, we really don't know very much about what Moshe looked like either. So can anyone tell me why Tanakh would want me to know, let's say that Esau was hairy, or that Esau was somehow red, a redhead, or have a red complexion? Okay, we're going to come back to that, but feel free to write an answer in the chat as I move on. Okay, after that, we are told, of course, the story of Esau coming in from the field. We know he's a hunter. And there's a very interesting pasuk when he encounters, very good, YCT students. That is one of the two possibilities. Excellent. Okay, let's pick up on that for a second. I don't know who give credit to it. Somehow that's the Greek chorus of YCT students get credit for that one. Okay, so sometimes you need to know a detail because it's going to impact on the plot. That is totally correct. Okay, I will give a couple of examples in a second. Can anyone, though, generate a second category where else it would matter? Excellent, Hanan Kessler. We have a great group. I wish I was in person with you guys. You guys are a fun group. What if it shows them about the person involved? What if it's symbolic? I think those are the two basic categories. Let's think about a couple of examples. Why is it important to know that Yosef is good looking? Well, that explains why Eshet Potiphar is interested in him. So it advances the plot. Why is it important to know that Ehud is a lefty? We're not told in Tanakh usually when people are lefties or righties. Well, that, see, I already going too fast. Sorry, closed caption person. Okay, it's important to know that Ehud is a lefty because that's going to impact on how he's able to attack Eglon Melech Moab. Okay, let's go to our scenario. Why is it important that Esau is hairy? Well, that's going to make it more difficult for Stephen Weiner. 1 second, very interesting. That's going to make it more difficult for Yaakov to impersonate him. So let's all agree. Sometimes physical characteristics are there to impact on the plot because they impact on the plot. But I think the other possibility is very well said. What would redness make me think of? Okay, so I think in a lot of cultures, and here you can look at Rashi if you want, red would associate with blood or aggression. So what does Rashi say in the first source? Admoni, Siman, who it's a sign, shofek damim. He's someone who spills blood. Now, again, I think this is perhaps a negative character trait of Esau, but I'm not sure it has to be negative. It just means that he has an aggressive streak. He has a violent streak. I think that certainly fits the biblical account. After all, his profession is hunting, and he does want to kill his brother. So I don't think it's a stretch to say Esau has a certain aggressive streak. So now notice what just happened. We did another move. We're going to hopefully see like 4 or 5 different beautiful moves of Tanakh. We saw already, okay, Dimitri, I totally agree. We saw already how you could have purposeful ambiguity. Now we have move number 2. If we normally don't tell you physical characteristics, that highlights when we do. Okay, that highlights when we do. And therefore, we should ask what's going on. Esau is hairy, Esau's red. What does that convey? Now, I assume Stephen Weiner means that, Stephen, do you mean that the hair is both, the redness is both, or both are both? I assume you mean the hair is both, right? You mean the hair is both? Okay, good. So I assume what Stephen means is that hair both advances the plot, as we said, and hair might give you a sense of a person who's part of the animal kingdom out there hunting, right? So that could also be both symbolic and reflective, and very good, and advance the plot. Okay, now for our third technique. Okay, and I just want to give credit, by the way, those who are interested in this, really, you should read 2 books. One is by Robert Alter, The Art of Biblical Narrative, and the other is by Meir Sternberg, called The Poetics of Biblical Narrative. I learned a tremendous amount from the 2 of them. They've really changed my Tanakh study. Okay, here we go. Okay, so now let's go to another technique that a lot of moderns are into, and they call it intertextuality. What does that mean? That a later story will purposely connect to an earlier story. And there are really 2 ways to do that, right? I could have a similar plot line, But even better, I could have similar wording. And sometimes I have both. I will briefly mention the most convincing one. I once said the biggest skeptic about intertextuality has to admit this example. Okay, here's the example. We all know that, I should say we all know. I imagine we know the story of the guests who come to Stone and Lot puts them up, and then the whole town comes and says, bring them out so that we may know them. Okay, we want to rape the guests. There's a story at the end of Sefer Shoftim called Pilegesh Begiva, which is remarkably similar, right? There are some guests looking to be taken in. Someone takes them in a little town in Shevet Binyamin called Giv'ah. And the whole, not the whole town actually, but people show up to the door and say, bring out the guests so that we may know them. And by the way, it's amazing how similar it is in both stories. What does the host say to try to protect the guests? Anyone know? What does the host say in both stories? A kind of a funny way to protect the guests. Oh, instead of these men that you want to rape, why don't you take, I'll throw 2 women out there, right? What does Lot say? Take my daughters instead. Also in Giv'ah, we have something quite similar. Now, the plot already is eerily similar. If you look at the wording, it's like phrase after phrase. There is no way to deny that the author of Pilegesh B'Giv'ah wanted us to compare it to Stone. Now, of course, when you have, okay, good. Okay, YCT students, good to have you with us. I see there's like 3 of you there. It's great. Okay, got a little wave there. Okay, excellent. Are you guys in the YCT Beit Midrash? Excellent. Okay, so now, of course, if we want to make this connection, what's an obvious question to ask? Is the connection to make a comparison or a contrast, right? It could be both, of course. Okay, now let's go to our example. Sorry, one last thing about the previous example. Do we want to say the people of Giv'ah are so corrupt, they've turned into stone, that Jews could turn into stone? That's one possibility. Or would we say, no, there are real differences between the stories. They're not the same. We're supposed to notice the differences. Those who are curious is not my topic, but see the Ramban on the stone story. The Ramban really develops what he thinks are the differences between the 2 stories. Okay, let's go back here. And I see already that we have a knowledgeable group because Dimitri already knew this. Let's say I'm curious about that phrase Adamoni, and I run to my handy dandy concordance. Actually, probably none of you use a concordance anymore, right? Fine. I do a search on Sefaria or Bar Ilan. Frida Birnbaum still use a concordance. Way to go, Frida, you and I. Okay, maybe only people over 50 still use a concordance. Okay, so in any case, I once tried to argue to my students, Alana Lubin. Alana, I hope this is okay. Can I ask, how old are you? Oh my God, 37-year-olds still use a concordance. Amazing. I once tried to argue to my students that I could find it faster in a concordance than they would find it on Sefaria, which was a great trick, except for the fact that they usually won, I have to admit. Okay, but Frida, write in the chat if you can, Frida. I see Frida wants to comment on this. Okay, so I open my concordance and I look for the word Admoni. What will I discover? There is only one other person in Tanakh called Admoni. Who is the one other person in Tanakh called Admoni? As Dimitri said, David HaMelech. So if there's only 2 people called, okay, Frida, you got a point there. Okay, so see guys, everyone has to own a concordance, at least for Shabbat. What if you have a Tanakh challenge at your Shabbos lunch table? No, Sefaria is not going to help you then. Okay, so here we go. So what is, now again, you don't have to say this, but what are you tempted to say? Tanakh wants me to think about David HaMelech in comparison to Esau. Now, I just want to make a suggestion that I think this really could go both ways. You could fool David and say David is violent like Esau. In fact, he's involved in a lot of war. He sends Uriah Hachiti to his death. One could say, unfortunately, David is Esau-like. Conversely, one could say what Dimitri suggested above, that people could have an aggressive streak and use it in a better way or a worse way. Maybe David was able to channel his aggression in a more productive way than Esau. So I'm not going to take a stand, but but I think it's a good example of how this intertextuality, these word connections, could in fact go both ways. Okay, so we've seen a third technique now, right? Beyond the question of physical characteristics, how similar wording could be used to make a point. One last interesting thing, I've been calling this the modern literary approach, but I think something is very, Stephen, I'm going to read your point in 1 second. Okay, one fascinating thing is, who did this before Robert Alter and Meir Sternberg? Not so much the Rishonim, not so much Rashi and Ibn Ezra, but interesting enough, who did it? Who was interested in making associative word connections? Chazal. So it's kind of fascinating. In some ways, the modern literary people are skipping past Ibn Ezra, Rashbam, and Rashi, and skipping back to Medrash Rabbah. Medrash Rabbah picks up on this. Medrash Rabbah says there's a comparison between Esau and David. Now, granted, the Midrash is more interested in the contrast, but the Midrash notices it, right? So I think it's very fascinating how someone like Robert Alter is back in the world of Breshit Rabbah. Okay, let me just see what Stephen wrote here. Very good, Stephen, excellent point, excellent point. Okay, let's go on to the fourth technique. Okay, and again, one of my problems, guys, there's just too much I want to discuss with you. So we're not going to get to it all, but hopefully you'll get enough good stuff, you'll be satisfied. Now, how does Esau describe what he wants? So let's listen carefully. Again, he's hungry. He comes from the field. He encounters his brother with food. What does he say? Vayomer Esau el Yaakov, halitenina, feed me, min hadom hazeh, from this red stuff, ki ayef anochi, because I am very tired. Okay. Al Kain Kara Shemo Edom. That's how he got the name Edom. Now, there are two really unusual things about this pasuk. One is the verb haliteni. And here again, I would say, perhaps we'll call this our fourth technique, careful word choice. Tanakh is very careful about word choice. And one could argue, I think, a very interesting question about language. One could argue there's no such thing as a true synonym, meaning every word has its own resonance. Now, haliteni is a really unusual word. In fact, if you look at Ibn Ezra, I'm not going to focus now. Anyone wants to look at Ibn Ezra in the sources? Guess what Ibn Ezra says? Ein lo chaver. It's a phrase I love. What does it mean that haliteni has no friends? Is haliteni socially awkward? It hangs out in the corner at parties? No, what does ein lo chaver mean? There is no other word form. This root is unique. It does not appear elsewhere in Tanakh. So we should really sit up and take note. If you have such an unusual word, haliteni, especially when there's a perfectly good word, right? Couldn't Esau have said hachileni, right? The word achal is ubiquitous. Why does Tanakh go with haliteni? Okay, so that's the first thing I would take note of. Secondly, isn't it a little bit odd that he says ha'adom hazeh? Like, what's the purpose of repetition? Not just this red stuff, but give me this red stuff. And perhaps maybe just call it by name. Call it like a lentil dish. Call it lentil soup. I really want to apologize to the captioner. I get excited and start to speed up. It is a heroic job to be assigned to be my caption person. I apologize. Okay. So let's go to the Mefarshim sheet if you have it for 1 second. Okay, let us look at some very powerful ideas in Rashi and the Rashbam. Okay, so look at Rashi and Pasuk Lamed. What's haliteni? Eftach pi, I will open my mouth. Vishvoch harbe litocha, and pour a lot in there. Now, when what is Rashi claiming? That it's not the same as achal. Achal could be a dignified eating. Haliteni is some kind of ravenous eating, some kind of gluttonous eating. It's like a hot dog eating contest. That's haliteni. Now, how does Rashi know that? So notice Rashi really has to struggle here. I'm not going to go into it, but those of you who want can look. He quotes a Gemara where the verb is used, meaning he couldn't go to help for somewhere else in Tanakh because this word is only once in Tanakh. He says, maybe there's a Gemara that could help me figure out what it means. And based on a Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, Rashi decides that Haliteni is pour a lot in right away. Okay, we'll return to that. Let us now go to Rashi's grandson. We'll do a family affair here. Okay, what is going on with Hadom Hazeh? So look, please, at the Rashbam on Lamed. Says the Rashbam in Hadom Hazeh, Derech Adam Hamimaher. What is the way of a person who is in a rush? Lishol davar mechavero, and he's asking, he's very eager. Kofel et dvarav. He doubles his words. Namely, this doubling shows a certain haste, a certain urgency, perhaps even a certain impetuosity. I think we're all like that. Like, I don't know, we'll make fun of myself for a second. I like cheesecake too much, right? So let's say it's Shavuos night and I just can't wait. So I run into the kitchen and say, the cheesecake. Like I said it twice because I'm excited. I'm eager. I'm impetuous. I can't wait, right? So Esau perhaps, but notice what we're doing here. We are seeing how Tanakh, it's just so beautifully written, right? It doesn't say Esau is impetuous, right? It does it much more subtly. It conveys the value judgments and the characters, not by telling you what they are, by showing you what they are. So now I think we could claim that in this first story, we see the impetuosity of Esau. Esau is a man in a hurry. Where have we seen this so far? Two aspects thus far. Haliteni, not hachileni. He's not going to eat with a knife and fork. Pour it in there. Okay. Secondly, hadom hazeh. He's not going to calmly say, can I have some lentil soup? He's going to say, give me that red stuff. That's what I want. Okay, now I think you could, many of you, I know it's a very strong group here. You probably already realize where I'm going next. Where else in this story, let's say you wanted to build my theory, that part of Esau's character flaw is that he's impetuous. So as the story progresses, where else do you have impetuosity or haste, perhaps, on the part of Esau? I think it's pretty clear you have both. What do you say? Again, obviously this sentence conveys haste, impetuosity. But what does he then go on to do, or how is he described that would also indicate, indeed, those character traits? And I want to write a suggestion. I'm sure some of you have it. But what about what he then goes on to do? He goes on to sell the Bechorah. Couldn't we argue that that is a pretty impetuous move? What do? You're kind of hungry. You're famished. You're exhausted. And next thing you know, you sell your birthright for a pot of lentil soup. Now, I admit some of you might tell me, but he says, Hinei anochi holech lamut, meaning he has to do it. He's going to die. What if I say that, I'm not sure we should take that literally, that Esau might be saying, I'm a hunter, I have a dangerous profession, or he might be using hyperbole. I think it's unlikely that he's really on death's door. So I think one could say the very act of selling the Bechorah is impetuosity. Okay, last one, guys. What is the last pasuk? And then we're going to finish this story, move on to the next story. What does it say at the last pasuk? Vayochal, vayesht, he ate and drank. Vayakam, vayelach, he got up and went. Vayives Esav et ha-Bechorah, he degrades the Bechorah. This is really unusual. What did we just have? 5 action verbs in a row, right? If I challenge you to think of any other place in Tanakh we have this, I think you'd really struggle. Again, Vayochal, Vayesht, he ate and drank. Vayakam, Vayelach, he got up and went. Vayives Esav et ha-Bechorah, and he degraded the birthright. Can we not argue that this is a man of haste? 5 verbs in a row. So now we've seen a whole bunch of more techniques, how the psukim convey the impetuosity of Esau. Just to review again, I think we've got 4 things to make this argument. The unusual verb haliteni, the description of adom hazeh, the willingness to sell the birthright for the lentils, and finally, the 5 verbs in a row. Okay, so we've learned something about Esau. We said Esau was good about kibbud av, which I think is true, or at least kibbud av. At the same time, he had a certain aggressive streak, perhaps shared with David HaMelech, and he had a certain impetuosity that is manifest here. Okay, that finishes part one. We now go to part two. Okay, so I'm now going to look at the source sheet again. We're going to go, actually, one more thing in part one, I'm sorry. I just want to show you one Radak. Okay, now, one of the things, again, I've said I love about Tanakh is that no one's black and white. And even more interesting, a lot of the classic Mefarshim shared that view. Because let me say what I mean by how why it's striking that they shared that view. Sometimes Tanakh itself makes it clear that the great figure is messed up, right? So, for example, Moshe obviously does something in the Mei Meriva story, whether it's hitting the rock or getting angry, that is problematic, right? So no one, I think it's hard to read those psukim and not say Moshe sinned. Okay, but what's interesting is some Rishonim are willing to say it even when the psukim are not clear. I mean, they think we could evaluate these figures and respectfully say that this particular move was wrong. Most famously, the Ramban does this when Avram says in Egypt that Sarah is his wife. Okay, without getting to details, the Ramban thinks this is not the proper behavior, even though the psukim do not at all make clear that Avram's mistaken here. And indeed, Avram has his defenders. One could read a Barbanel, one could read Rav Hirsch, and see a defense of Avram. Okay, but we do have Rishonim who are open to finding this gray, even when it's not explicit. So let's just look at the Radak for 1 second. This is kind of fascinating. Maybe there are some of you who are in this chat, who are in this discussion, who are kind of a little troubled by Yaakov, maybe to some degree taking advantage of Esau. I said what I think is true. Esau is not at death's door, but he's still famished and not thinking straight. And here Yaakov has himself the Bechorah. So let's just look at the Radak, okay, at the end of Pasuk Lamed Aleph. So first the Radak explains that the Bechorah meant giving a certain amount of honor, and that Yaakov found it very hard to honor Esau. He didn't really respect who Esau was, and it was too much to honor him. So that's why he bought the Bechorah. However, let me highlight here. Look what it says. It's pretty remarkable. What does the Radak say at the end? V'af al pikein, nonetheless, ne'nash bazeh. He was punished. L'fisha asa bazeh kineged min ha'olam. He did against the custom of the world, that the older brother really is supposed to have a certain honorable position, and therefore it's unfair. Not only that, how is he punished? Look at this remarkable Radak. V'chibdo kavod gadol acharkein. What did he have to do? Ultimately, let's think about it. We talked about the ambiguity of Rav Yavod Sa'ir. But if we ask ourselves, when Esau and Yaakov meet all those years later, who mostly honors who? I think we'd have to say that it is mostly Yaakov honoring Esau, right? Yaakov brings him a very big gift. Yaakov bows down to him multiple times. So at that point, I think it's pretty obvious that Yaakov ends up honoring Esau more than Esau honors Yaakov. For the Radak, that is almost Yaakov's comeuppance, right? That this was not really appropriate behavior. And therefore, that's why Yaakov ends up having to honor Esau. So again, I think, I don't deny that there are better and worse characters in Tanakh. Don't deny that at all. All things being equal, Moshe Rabbeinu is a good guy and Achav is a bad guy. No denying that. But again, there's always a bit of complexity. Okay. In fact, there's a very interesting essay by a man named Eric Orbach, a very famous essay where he compares Homer and the Bible. And if you want to look at it, it's called the what's it called? The Odysseus' Scar. Odysseus' Scar is what it's called. Okay, and he says that in Homer, the characters always act the same way in every scene, right? If you know what Odysseus is like in, I don't know, scene 3, Odysseus is the same thing in scene 7, right? They're all the same. And biblical characters are not like that. They could change, they could develop, they could have different aspects. So it's well worth reading. It's actually a short essay. Eric Orbach, Odysseus' Scar. Okay, so now what have we seen here? Yaakov is, for the most part, a good character. But maybe there's a problem. He does take advantage of Esau. Maybe that's problematic, and maybe he actually gets punished for it, and indeed has to honor Esau. Esau has a lot of problematic aspects, but he is good at honoring his father. So we really do see the gray over here. Okay, let's go on to one more point. If you don't mind, I just can't resist this because it follows up on something we said. We're going to briefly leave Yaakov and Esau behind and go to their father. Okay, what are we told? Let's skip to the next story. Okay, that was the first story. What's the next story, of course? That Rivka overhears that Yaakov is going to give some kind of bracha. That Yitzchak is going to give some kind of bracha to Esau. She thinks Yaakov is the son deserving of brachot, and therefore she has this whole ruse that Yaakov will pretend to be Esau. Let's just look at the first pasuk in that chapter for a second. So in Perek Chav Zayin, what's the first pasuk? Vayi ki zaken Yitzchak. Yitzchak is older. Vatichena einav mirot, and his eyes are weak. Yitzchak has been going blind. Vayikrat Esau beno Agadol, and he calls his son. Vayomer lav bni, vayomer lav hineni. Now let's think for a second, because here I think again what Stephen Weiner did before might come into play. We said that Tanakh does not usually talk about physical characteristics, but it wants us to know that Yitzchak is going blind, that Yitzchak can't see. So let's plug in our two approaches once again. What did we say? That physical characteristics are either to advance the plot or to reflect on the personality. And I think here, the Stephen Weiner method will be great. I think one could easily argue that it's both. So if you want to just see this in the commentaries for 1 second, please go back to the source sheet. I was very excited to find this. Look at source 7. Vatechena einav mirot. Says the Bechor Shor, it's just about the plot. Shelo titama, don't wonder, eich nitzchalef lo Yaakov Esau. How could he possibly make a mistake? Meaning if Yitzchak's not blind, the plot is a non-starter. How could Yaakov possibly show up and pretend to be Esau? But if Yitzchak's blind, it works. Okay, so that, of course, would be one possibility in the blindness. The blindness advances the plot, just like Esau's hairiness. However, I think it's obvious to all of us that blindness could be deeply symbolic. Look at Rav Chaim Paltiel. Rav Chaim Paltiel is one of the commentaries that owes a big debt to the Bar Ilan program. Not sure how many people looked him up till he made it into the Bar Ilan. Look what he says. Vatechena einav mirot, mishum dichtiv, it's written, vayahav Yitzchak et Esav kitzayid b'fiv, v'chtiv ki hashochad ye'aver. Bribery creates blindness. Namely, Yitzchak let himself be bribed by Esau. That Esau really was not as noble as Yitzchak thought, and some of the bringing food was not so much from a noble kibbutz. Maybe there was an element that was much more calculating about it. Oh, I'll win my dad over and get the family legacy. Okay, but notice blindness could be profoundly symbolic. Like arguably, that's why King Lear goes blind, right? So here we have blindness doing double duty. Blindness advances the plot, and blindness is symbolic. One last point. We talked about intertextuality. That comes back again here also. Okay, we might think, wait, who else has sight issues in Tanakh? Look at the Sforno in 9. Vatechena einav, kumo shekara le'eli. Right, this happens at the beginning of Shoftim with Eli. Shelo micha bibanav, who didn't do a good job of protesting the misbehavior of his kids. So according to the Sforno, it gets even deeper. What do we have? We have a symbolic blindness, but we also have an intertextuality, namely in Tanakh. Okay, Allison, well said. Very nicely said, Allison. We have a parental blindness. My parents who somehow don't get it with their children, they, as it were, are blind. So in my mind, this is pretty convincing. The combination of the natural symbolism of going blind with the comparison to Eli. Once again, we have this beautiful, beautiful writing of Tanakh. We have we're normally not told people's physical state. it A, advances the plot, B, it's symbolic, C, it links Yaakov with Eli. Okay, we're great. Now, I'm not sure when Dvir is going to call. Oh, that's very interesting. Okay, again, I feel bad. I can't give credit to the YCT students by name, but they keep making good points. So I tell you what, I'm going to go to my next point, but YCT students, I'm just curious, if you don't mind, if you could just write in the chat who you are. I'm just curious who your names are. This way I'll be able to give you credit in the future. That X was in my shir and he made a bunch of good comments. Okay, so let's go to, I don't know when we're going to go to questions. So I'm actually going to skip to the last section and we'll see, time permitting, I'll sneak one more thing in. Okay, what happens? Okay, thank you, Dvir. Thank you, Dvir. Okay, what happens at the end? Okay. All right, thank you, guys. I don't know your last names, but I guess I'll give credit to your first names. Okay, terrific. Okay, so let's talk about Yaakov and Esau. What was scene one in our analysis? Scene one is, right, the selling of the Bechorah for the Nizir. What is scene two? The stealing of the Bracha. What is scene three, of course? Scene three is much later when Yaakov returns after a 20-year sojourn in Lavan's house, right? 7 years for one daughter, 7 years for another daughter, another 6 years with the sheep, right? Yaakov is away for a really long time. And then he comes back and he meets Esau. And of course, he hears that Esau is coming with 400 men. So Yaakov is quite frightened about this prospect. And as we know, he engages in several strategies, right? One strategy is a gift, right? Win him over. He prays to God. He also divides the camp into two, right? Maybe a little, okay, if he attacks one camp, the other camp will be safe, etc. He's got multiple strategies. Of course, what ends up happening? Esau, in fact, ends up kissing Yaakov. Now, here's the really interesting thing. Like, how did that come about? Was that Esau's plan all along? Did Esau have a change of heart? So that's quite an interesting question. And again, in classic Tanakh fashion, Tanakh does not tell us what, or often does not tell us what's in their inner world. We have to try to read carefully and figure out what's in their inner world. So let's just look at a couple of commentaries and we'll see it's not an accident that there isn't a unified position on this, because it's really not so clear what happened to Esau. Okay, so let's go to, I think you'll find this very fascinating. Let's go to, let's go to Rashi on 22. Okay, we'll contrast Rashi and Ibn Ezra. Look at Rashi on source 22. Vayichab Keu, Esau embraces Yaakov. Nidgalglu rachamav, his mercy emerged. Kishraeu mishtachaveh kol hashtachavot halalu. Because Yaakov was so subservient in all his bowings to Esau. Namely, what happens according to one reading? Esau really was coming to attack. His old dream of killing his brother was on his mind. But guess what? 20 years had done their thing. And now that David is so giving to Esau, a huge gift, treating Esau as the Lord, as the nobleman. So Esau, he has a little brotherly mercy, right? So again, it would be an interesting take on Esau. Esau's coming to attack, but he decides in the end, as it were, Yaakov wins him over. Okay, however, I think there's another possibility. Let us look at the Ibn Ezra on 23. Okay, and we're going to look at the second half of the Ibn Ezra. There's one thing I'm glossing over here, just in the interest of time. Some of you may know that there are dots on one of the words. And what are the implications of those dots is lurking in the background here. So I am not interested in the second, but those you are, please read Rashi and Ibn Ezra about what the dots indicate. But the Ibn Ezra goes on to say in the second half, Ki al derech hapshat, what's the simple reading? Lo chashav Esav lasot ra la'achiv. Esau was never thinking to do evil to his brother. Meaning Yaakov was nervous, understandably, about Esau, but the reality is Esau had forgiven him already. Now, I think, let me ask one question, but I think the difference is really interesting in terms of the Esau personality. Now, one of you might say to me, if Esau's coming in peace, why does he have 400 men? I admit 400 men might be suggestive of a battle, but I'm not sure that exhausts the possible reasons someone could have a big camp. Maybe Esau was a very influential fellow. He was a chieftain. This was his entourage. I'm not sure 400 men by definition means that someone is coming for battle. But now we have two very interesting readings of Esau. And I'm not even sure which one. I'm curious what you guys think. Which one is more praiseworthy, right? Because what could one say? What's the more praiseworthy reading? The Ibn Ezra's reading. Esau had already forgiven Yaakov, and Yaakov was just nervous, but it worked out great. Esau was ready to hug and kiss him. You could say that's a more impressive personality, but maybe go the other way, actually. If Esau was nursing a resentment, yafeh. If Esau is nursing resentment for 20 years and is able to overcome it at the moment, maybe that's more impressive. So it's very interesting. I'm not sure which way to go with this. Is Esau the kind of person who'd forgiven Yaakov long ago? Or is Esau coming to attack? Very good. Is Esau coming to attack and then having a change of heart? You guys, you just made my day. Excellent. Guys, you know how Alana Lubin's, I have two proofs that Alana Lubin's intelligent. One, she uses a concordance. Two, she just made a great comment. Okay, very interesting. Like maybe we just talked before about how violence or aggression could go multiple ways. Maybe impetuousness even has its place. That Esau's, that was Ilana, that's really excellent. Ilana, where do you live? I'm going to continue while you tell me. Okay, that Esau's an impetuous fellow. We see his impetuosity in selling the Bechorah and his whole manner of speaking about the Nizir Ad Hashem. But maybe that's the kind of person who could have a positive shift. He has a moment of inspiration. He's been dreaming about vengeance on his brother for 20 years. And lo and behold, at the moment of truth, he has mercy on his brother, right? That there, the impetuosity goes in a different direction. A lot of great point. Okay, last point of the day here, guys, and then I'll open the floor to questions. I hope I've convinced you that Tanakh is beautifully written and the techniques are really worth studying. We talked before about careful word choice, and we used the example of haliteni as opposed to hachileni. If we move now to the third act, when Yaakov confronts Esau, there is also an example of very powerful word choice. Let's pay close attention. This is not on your source sheet. You can look in the psukim. Okay, what are we told? That Yaakov is giving a gift to Esau. Now, you probably all know that there are many biblical words for gift. For example, shai is a word for a gift, and mincha is a word for a gift. Okay, in the build-up to the story, when Yaakov is about to encounter Esau, there is the dominance of a one word. Which word is consistently being used? The word mincha. What does it say? I'll find you the pasuk in 1 second. Okay, so here we describe all the animals and the various things that he's given. It says, what's going to be when Esau asks you what they are? The amarta la'abdecha Yaakov, these belong to Yaakov. Mincha hi shlucha la'adoni le'Esav. He's sending a mincha ahead of the time for Esau. Notice the word mincha. Okay, as we move a little bit further down, ki amar achapra panav ba mincha. Anyone look at this? This is all Perek Lamed Bet. Once again, what kind is he giving? A mincha. Okay, so we're pretty consistent. Okay, then Yaakov wrestles with the Ish. Now we're after the wrestling, and now he's actually going to confront Esau face to face. Okay, what does it say? Here we go. So now I'm in Perek Lamed Gimel. Things are getting exciting here. Okay, so it says, okay, so first we have, 1 second. Here we go. V'lakachta minchati miyadi. Once again, third time in a row, right? Take my mincha, take my gift. And then, just so beautiful, what does Yaakov suddenly shift to in Pasuk Yud Aleph? Kachna et birchati. Take my bounty, take my blessing. Now, one way of highlighting a word is to use a different word multiple times and then to shift. I think it's a good argument that we have that going on over here. It's minchati 3 times. It's a mincha. All of a sudden, it's birchati. So, for the last time, if you don't mind, I'm just going to take another 2 minutes. Let us go to the source sheet for one last time and see again, even though I said that some of this really goes back to Chazal and not the Rishonim often would pick up on word choice. But look at the difference between Ramban and Abarbanel. Okay, if you look at the Ramban on 24, says the Ramban, Kaknat Berchati Hamincha. He kind of conflates the two. Oh, this is just another word for mincha, and his difference is rather minor as he goes on. So he doesn't make so much of it, the shift from mincha to berchati. However, in the Abarbanel in 27 says what probably a lot of you are thinking. I think, by the way, the Abarbanel was particularly sensitive to word choice. Okay, one day I'd like to write an article about how many modern literary endeavors the Abarbanel already picked up on. So look at the Abarbanel where I'm pointing. Hey, Shil Yaakov. Oh, what about brachot? Kachnat berchati ashuvet lach. Rotzelomar habracha asher barcheni avi. What bracha am I talking about? The bracha that Yitzchak blessed me. This is just powerful and beautiful writing. What's Yaakov saying? Guess what, Esau? I'm giving the bracha back. At the end of the day, I did not really steal your bracha. I'm honoring you. Kachnat berchati. So I think we've seen, just to sum for 1 minute, a lot of great. First of all, we've seen that the two things I said, Tanakh is not black and white. Notice Yaakov might be faulted for his taking advantage of Esau, and Esau both has kibbud av aim, or kibbud av, and perhaps also the ability to have mercy at the last minute. That is an impressive aspect of Esau. And secondly, we've seen all kinds of literary techniques here. We saw intertextuality, right? Admoni. We saw a clever word choice, haliteni, berchati. We saw purposeful ambiguity, v'rav yavod tzair. We've seen multiple verbs used to convey haste, vayocha, vayesht, vayakam, vaylach, vayivez. Okay, I think someone who thinks that there isn't beautiful literary art in Tanakh is just not reading, right? There's tremendous amount going on here. Okay, I will now open the floor to questions. Would anyone like to comment or question on our conversation? Okay, excellent. Okay, so one of the things Tanakh loves to do is also plays on words. And here also, I often wonder, I'm gonna throw this to the YCT students in a second. When you have a play on words, is that just adding literary beauty, just aesthetic pleasure, or is that deeply meaningful? So I'm just going to toss one example out there, and we'll see what the YCT students, the fearsome foursome, what they think about this specific example they just pointed out. Okay, guys, let's think about the first play on words in all of Chumash, in all of Tanakh. Okay, what do you have at the end of Perek Bet? Adam and Chava are naked, and the pasuk says that they were arumim, right? That's the word used for their nakedness. Okay, secondly, we have the very next pasuk in Perek Gimel. What are we told about the Nachash? Hanachash haya arum mikol chayat hasadeh. Now, the snake was not more naked than the other animals. They're all equally naked. What was the snake? It was more cunning than the other animals. So can we all agree that this is a play on words? We have arumim right next to arum, and they have two different meanings. We have arumim as naked, and arum as cunning and clever. Now, I'm not going to deal with it right now, but someone could try to argue that they are connected. That let me do one possibility. One possibility is there's no deeper meaning here. It's just a more beautiful book, right? When you have wordplay, when you have plays on words, it's a more aesthetic experience. That's all that's going on. Okay, I'm open to that possibility. But some people want there to always be deeper meaning. So if you're curious, guys, Yoni Grossman's written some beautiful books on Chumash. In Yonatan Grossman's book on Breshit, he tries to find a deeper meaning between the arumim connection, which I don't have time to develop right now. You can look it up. So I'm curious, YCT students, you guys had an interesting suggestion. You said that mincha is resonant of machaneh, right? Yaakov divides the camp. There's this machaneh, there's that machaneh. That plays well with the word mincha, right? Mincha and machaneh certainly sound alike. Okay, so that's right. I'm just curious, do you guys think that is aesthetic pleasure, or that there's some deeper point being made about machaneh and mincha. You don't have to answer right now, but I'm just curious what you guys think. Okay, does anybody else have a comment or question? We'll see if the YCT foursome has an approach here. Anybody else want to make a comment or question? Yeah, Dvir, are you saying something?
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Yitzchak Blau. We don't have time to field any more questions, but we'll continue this incredible conversation. And the next session will begin in 4 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, so I want to say thank you to Dvir and to all of you. I am just right now sending my email. If anybody has a comment or question, I'm happy to answer the email. You could just copy it now before we sign off here.